When the Enemy Tasted Bacon, September 1944. A Texas prison camp dining hall. And a Japanese man was crying over a strip of bacon. Not from joy, not from gratitude. He was crying because he had just understood something that no bomb, no battle, no military defeat could have taught him. He was crying because the bacon on his plate was proof. Proof that everything his government had told him about America was a lie. And in that moment, sitting in a Texas prison camp, eating better than his family had eaten in 3 years, he knew with absolute certainty that Japan had lost this war. Not because of firepower, not because of strategy, because of bacon. But this story is not about that man. This story is about the American who had to watch it happen. The Texas rancher who came to Crystal City wanting to hate the enemy and found something he never expected to find. Something that would break him open and put him back together as a different kind of man. His name was Robert Hayes, and what happened to him in the fall of 1944 is one of the most honest stories to come out of World War II. Before we get to Texas, I need to take you back 24 hours. Back to a California dock on a gray September morning. Back to the moment when Robert Hayes first looked the enemy in the eye. Because what he saw there was not what he came prepared to see. And nothing that followed would have been possible without that first moment of confusion on the Oakland waterfront. If you had a father or grandfather who served during this period, whether in the Pacific in Europe or stateside, I want to hear your story. Leave a comment below. The memories of your family are part of this history. Every one of them matters. Now let me tell you about Robert Hayes. He was 28 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, built wide across the shoulders from a lifetime of ranch work in the Texas Panhandle. His hands were the kind of hands that told a man's story before he opened his mouth. Calloused from barbed wire, scarred from fence posts, strong enough to pull a calf from the mud at 2 a.m. and still show up for breakfast. He was not rich. His family never had been. The Hayes Ranch was what people in that part of Texas called comfortable, which meant they had enough, and they were grateful for it, and they did not talk about it much. His father, Ben Hayes, had built that ranch from nothing across the years of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression without losing a single acre of land. That was the thing Robert grew up knowing about his father first. Before anything else, before the stories about the cattle prices or the long rides at dusk, what Robert knew about Ben Hayes was that the man did not quit. And Ben Hayes passed one thing to his son above everything else. Not the ranch, not the cattle, not even the land itself. He passed down a single sentence spoken on the porch of the ranch house on a fall evening in 1943, 3 weeks before the cancer finished what it had started in his lungs. Son Ben Hayes said, his voice low and steady even at the end. War brings out the worst in men. Killing is easy when you are scared and angry. But mercy, son. Mercy when you have every right to be cruel. That is what separates the civilized from the savage. You remember that whatever this war brings you. Ben Hayes died 6 days later, Robert was at Crystal City by the following spring. He had volunteered for duty escorting Japanese prisoners from the California coast to the internment facility in Texas, and most of the other men at Fort Sam Houston had looked at him like he had lost his mind. Real war was happening in Europe and the Pacific. Real combat, real glory, real purpose. Escorting prisoners was paperwork and bus rides and making sure people ate their dinner. But Robert had reasons for taking the assignment. Reasons he kept to himself. The main one had a name. Johnny Reyes grew up 4 miles down the road from the Hayes Ranch. He and Robert had been inseparable from the time they were 8 years old, riding horses through the mesquite country and getting into the kind of trouble that West Texas boys got into in the 1930s. Johnny married a girl named Maria from Amarillo when they were both 22. She was already pregnant when he shipped out. He never came back. The USS Houston went down in the Sunda Strait in March of 1942. Johnny Reyes was 24 years old. He died in cold water in the dark on the other side of the world, and his daughter grew up without ever hearing his voice. So when Robert Hayes stood on the Oakland dock that September morning with a clipboard in his hands, and the San Francisco Bay fog rolling thick across the water, he was not simply doing a job. He was doing something personal, something he would not have been able to put into words exactly, but something that had to do with looking the enemy in the eye, with understanding what kind of people had taken Johnny from the world, with making sense of something that had not made sense for 2 years. He was ready. He had prepared himself. The transport vessel cut through the gray water and docked at 9 in the morning. The cargo hold doors opened with a long metallic groan, and 47 Japanese women walked out into American sunlight. Robert watched them come down the gangplank and felt something shift inside his chest that he did not have a name for yet. They were not what the newsreels had shown him. The newsreels had shown fanatics. Soldiers with wild eyes and screaming mouths charging into gunfire without hesitation, dying for an emperor they believed to be a god. The training films had been explicit about the Japanese character. Ruthless, savage, indifferent to pain and death. These women looked like they had been slowly starved for 2 years and put on a boat. He could see it from 20 feet away. The way the uniforms hung loose on their frames. The sharpness of wrists and cheekbones. The careful, controlled way they moved like women who had learned to conserve every calorie of energy because there was no guarantee of more where that came from. Their eyes were scanning constantly, cataloging, looking for the threat that their training told them was coming. Every one of them fully expected that the American soldiers at the bottom of that gangplank were about to hurt them. Robert watched them come down and felt his carefully assembled hatred developing cracks he did not want. The 14th woman down was young, 22, maybe 23. Small, even by the standard of the others, somewhere around 90 pounds. Her uniform had been pressed with care that morning, despite everything. Her eyes were dark and alert, and completely controlled the eyes of someone who had decided before leaving that ship that she would not show fear. no matter what happened next. She was 3 steps from the bottom when her legs gave out. Weeks on a transport ship. Months of not enough food before that. The last few steps of the gangplank were steep, and her body simply stopped cooperating. Robert caught her before he thought about it. It was pure reflex. She was falling, and he caught her, one hand at her shoulder and one at her arm, and for a moment her full weight was in his hands, and he felt what he had seen from a distance confirmed up close. There was almost nothing there. A person reduced to the bare minimum of what a person needed to be. For 1 second, before she pulled herself upright and away from him, their eyes met. He had been expecting hatred. He had been expecting the fanatic's glare that the newsreels had promised him. He had been expecting to see the enemy. What he saw was fear. Not the theatrical kind. Not the kind you performed for effect. The raw animal kind that lives underneath everything else when a creature believes it is about to be destroyed and cannot see a way out. She pulled away from him and stood on her own 2 feet and straightened her spine and arranged her face into careful neutrality. Robert stepped back. Professional distance. He gestured toward the military buses waiting on the dock. "This way," he said. She did not understand the English words. She understood the gesture. She moved toward the buses without looking at him again. Robert stood there for a moment after she passed. He looked at his hands. He thought about Johnny Reyes. He thought about Maria raising their daughter alone in Amarillo. He thought about the 2 years of certainty he had been carrying about what the Japanese were and what they deserved. Then he picked up his clipboard and went back to work. The buses rolled out of the Oakland port, and Robert had given the driver one instruction before they left. Take Market Street. It was the long way to the train station, the driver had said. Robert said he knew. Take it anyway. He sat in the front seat and watched the street through the windshield rather than the mirror because he did not want to watch their faces with too much attention. It felt like something that needed to happen without an audience, even if he was unavoidably present. Market Street in September 1944 was a kind of accidental argument. Department stores with windows full of goods that had not disappeared even with the war. Restaurants with signs advertising steaks and seafood. A movie theater marquee announcing a film nobody had ever heard of. And everywhere, the lights, the ordinary electric lights of a city that had never been asked to shut them off to save power for the war effort. Women in colored dresses, leather handbags, jewelry. A woman laughing on the sidewalk, actually laughing, while a small child walked beside her, eating something from a paper wrapper. The bus was completely silent behind him. He did not look in the mirror. He looked at the city and thought about what it must look like to someone who had been told it did not exist this way, who had been told the lights were off and the shelves were empty and the people were weak and frightened and ready to break. At the Southern Pacific train station, the women filed onto the passenger cars, and Robert watched the surprise move through them a second time. Cushioned bench seats, tables, windows that opened, a dining car where meals would be served during the 3-day journey to Texas. Not a prison transport, a passenger train. Her name, he would learn through the camp's civilian interpreter over the following days, was Keiko Tanaka. She was 23 years old, born in Hiroshima, the second daughter of a government bureaucrat who considered his family middle class by Japanese standards, which meant electricity in 2 rooms of the house, power that went off at 9 each night to conserve fuel for the war effort, and no refrigerator. Ice was delivered in blocks by a vendor who came twice a week in summer. She had trained as a nurse in Osaka, graduated in 1942, and served at a field hospital on Saipan until the island fell in July of 1944. She had come off that transport ship ready to endure whatever came next. The training films had been very clear about what American soldiers did to prisoners. Keiko Tanaka was a nurse, and she dealt in evidence, and the evidence she had been given said this was going to be bad. The evidence on Market Street had said something else entirely. On the train, she sat in a window seat with a small notebook in her hands. The notebook her mother had given her before nursing school, before everything changed. The first half was full of medical notes in careful Japanese. The second half was blank. She turned to the first blank page and wrote nothing yet. She was not ready to write what she was seeing because writing it would make it real, and making it real meant accepting the first edge of something enormous and terrible that she was not yet prepared to accept. The dining car opened at 6:30 that first evening. Robert stood near the serving line while the meal was brought out. Roast beef sandwiches, potato chips, fresh apples, cookies, cold milk in glass bottles with condensation already forming on the sides. The women stopped at the sight of their plates, and the stillness in the car changed the quality of the air. He had seen this before with German prisoners with Italian internees. The moment when people who had been told they were walking into brutality found themselves standing in front of more food than they had seen in months. They always thought it was poisoned first. Robert picked up his own plate. Same meal, identical portions served from the same pans by the same people. He took a large, deliberate bite of the roast beef sandwich and chewed slowly, making sure every woman in the car could see him eating what they were being offered. Not poisoned, just dinner. The women did not move. Robert looked down the row of faces and his eyes stopped on Keiko Tanaka. She was not looking at her plate. She was looking at him with the focused evidence-gathering expression he was learning to recognize. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at his food and took another bite. She looked at her plate. She picked up the sandwich and took the smallest bite that could still be called a bite. Then she stopped. Robert did not watch what happened on her face. He had seen enough. He went to the front of the car and sat down and started writing a letter to his brother Thomas, who was somewhere in France with the army. He wrote about the journey, about Oakland, about the women on the train. He wrote a sentence that stopped him. He wrote, "They do not look like what we were told they would look like, Tom." He stared at that sentence for a long time. Then he kept writing. He was 3 pages in when the shouting started. It came from 2 cars back. He was moving before he had consciously decided to move, pushing through the corridor between cars, arriving to find a cluster of women around a seat near the window, where an older woman had slumped sideways unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. Keiko Tanaka was already on her knees beside the woman. She had 2 fingers on the pulse point at the throat. She was checking skin color at the lips and fingernails. She was doing what trained people did in emergencies, which was to see clearly and move efficiently, and not let the noise of the situation override the information the body was providing. "Help," she said in English. "Please. Water, medicine. She need doctor." Robert dropped down beside her. "What do you need?" She looked at him for 1/2 second with an expression that recalibrated something between them permanently. Not gratitude, not surprise. The look of one professional recognizing another in the middle of a job that needed doing. He followed her instructions, exactly handing her what she asked for. Holding the woman's head at the angle she indicated, speaking into his radio to arrange for a doctor to be waiting at Albuquerque. Kenji Watanabe, the young Nisei interpreter employed by the INS, arrived in the car within 2 minutes and translated the medical exchange. But by then, Robert and Keiko had already established a working rhythm that did not require words. She would indicate. He would act. That was the system, and it worked. The woman on the floor was 58-year-old Fumiko Sato, a former government secretary from Tokyo, and she was suffering from severe dehydration and malnutrition that had been building for months before anyone put her on a transport ship. For 20 minutes in the narrow aisle of a Southern Pacific passenger train, somewhere in the Nevada desert, Robert Hayes and Keiko Tanaka worked together to keep her alive. When the train pulled into Albuquerque and the army doctor came aboard, Fumiko Sato was stable. The doctor examined her established an IV drip and looked at Keiko with the directness of one medical professional assessing another. "Good work," he said. "You a nurse?" Keiko understood enough to nod once. After he left, after the IV was running, and Fumiko Sato was sleeping with color returning slowly to her face, Robert and Keiko stood together in the narrow space between train cars. The desert moved past them at 60 miles an hour. The late afternoon sun turned the rocks outside the window the color of old copper. "You are a real nurse," Robert said. She understood him. She nodded, tired but precise. "You helped," she said carefully, choosing words from a vocabulary built out of medical textbooks rather than conversation. "Why?" "She is enemy." Robert thought about it. He thought about what his father would have said. He thought about the right answer and the true answer, and whether they were the same thing. "She is a sick old lady," he said. "That is all that matters right now." Keiko looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked out at the desert. Robert looked out at the desert too. They stood there without speaking while the sun went down over New Mexico and the train carried them both toward Texas. That night, Keiko sat beside Fumiko Sato's seat while the old woman slept. The car was dark except for the reading lamps at intervals along the ceiling. Small, warm circles of light in the moving darkness. She opened her notebook and wrote in Japanese the way she had been trained to write observations factually and specifically, and without embellishment. She wrote about the agricultural valley they had passed through that afternoon, fields stretching to every horizon, mechanical harvesters moving through crops with an unstoppable confidence that 100 Japanese farmers working together could not have matched. She wrote about the roast beef sandwich. She wrote about Fumiko Sato and the army doctor who had said good work. Then she switched to English, the English she had built word by word from smuggled American nursing textbooks practiced alone, kept private. She wrote 4 words. America is not weak. She looked at what she had written for a long time. Those 4 words were not just a factual observation. They were a demolition. They took down a structure built carefully over years of schooling and national pride, and the specific certainty that comes from never having been given a reason to doubt. If America was not weak, then Japan had known that and started the war anyway. If America was not weak, then the people who had planned this war had sent their own citizens into it without honest information about what they were facing. She closed the notebook without writing any of that. 4 words were enough for one night. In the front of the car, Robert was finishing his letter to Thomas. He had been more honest than he planned. He wrote about catching Keiko on the gangplank and what he had seen in her eyes. He wrote about the 20 minutes in the train aisle. He wrote a sentence he considered crossing out and then left. I keep wondering what Johnny would think if he could see this, Tom, because I am not sure I understand it myself. He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket. He would mail it from Crystal City. The second day brought Utah and then Colorado, the landscape shifting constantly through the window-red rock country, giving way to mountains that made the women press forward in their seats all over again. Robert moved through the cars during the day, distributing water, checking on the passengers, making sure Kenji was nearby when communication was needed. At midday, he paused beside Keiko's seat and looked out the window at the Rockies for a moment. Big country, he said. She considered this. Yes, she said. Very big. He asked through Kenji where her family was in Japan. Hiroshima, she said. He nodded. He did not know anything specific about Hiroshima yet. Nobody in that train car did. The city was still 11 months away from becoming the kind of word that changed the meaning of everything around it. On the 3rd morning, the train crossed into Texas, and Robert felt it before he saw it. The particular quality of the flat light, the way the sky opened into something that had no ceiling. This was his country. The smell of it through the open window was dust and mesquite and distance and something in his chest that had been tight for 3 days, loosened by one notch. He walked through the cars and told the women through Kenji that they were in Texas now, 3 hours from Crystal City. He watched their faces as he said it and saw the animal wariness return the calculation of a creature approaching unknown territory. As Crystal City came into view through the train windows, Keiko moved to stand where she could see clearly. She had her notebook in her hands, but she was not writing. She was looking. White painted cottages in neat rows, tree-lined paths with hand-painted name signs, a central yard where children were running in the late afternoon heat, a baseball diamond with a proper backstop and chalk lines on the dirt, garden plots dense with late summer vegetables, tomatoes and squash, and beans staked on wooden frames. And in the distance, glinting in the Texas sun, what appeared to be a swimming pool. A swimming pool in a prison camp. Reiko appeared beside her and said something low and rapid in Japanese. Kenji translated from behind them both. "This cannot be the prison." Robert said nothing. He had learned something over the past 3 days about when words helped and when they did not. This was a moment that did not need words. The truth was outside the window doing its own work. The buses from the station took them through Crystal City before turning toward the camp, and the town itself continued the argument that had been building since Oakland. A hardware store, a grocery, a movie theater with a marquee. Ordinary, continuous, unhurried American life proceeding in the middle of a world war without apparent strain. The camp gate opened and the buses rolled through. J.L. O'Rourke, the officer in charge of Crystal City, was waiting at the administration building. He was a compact, deliberate man in his 50s who had been running this facility long enough to know what the job required. He waited until all 47 women were assembled in the September heat before he spoke. He explained the rules through Kenji in a flat, unhurried voice. 3 meals daily in the community dining hall. Medical care at the camp hospital, which operated around the clock. Educational programs in both Japanese and English. Work opportunities for those who wanted them. Freedom of movement within the camp boundaries at all times. One of the older women raised her hand and asked through Kenji where the cells were. O'Rourke said there were no cells. She asked where the punishment block was. He said there was no punishment block. She asked what happened to people who broke the rules. He told her they were spoken to by the Internal Security Division. The older woman looked at Keiko with an expression that needed no translation. Something is wrong here, and I do not know what it is. Robert escorted Keiko and her 3 cottage mates through the Japanese section of the camp to cottage number 23. The path took them past the community garden and the Japanese school, a real school with a blackboard visible through the window and children sitting at desks. Past the recreation building. Past the baseball diamond, where a group of teenage boys were finishing a game in the long evening light, calling to each other in Japanese with the particular unself-conscious joy of boys who had temporarily forgotten everything except the game. Cottage number 23 was one of the original 3-room structures from the camp's early construction, slightly larger than the standard barracks housing, with a small front porch and a mesquite tree at the corner that threw shade across the door in the afternoon hours. Robert unlocked the door and stepped to the side of it, leaving the entrance clear. "After you," he said. The four women entered, and Robert stayed in the doorway, one hand on the frame, giving them space to move through the rooms while remaining present in case they had questions. It was a deliberate choice, the posture of someone who understood the difference between supervising and intruding. Keiko went to the electric lamp on the side table near the window and turned it on. The room filled with clean, steady light. She turned it off. She turned it on again. Off. On. Robert watched her do this and understood something that no intelligent summary had ever communicated to him. He was watching a person encounter unlimited electricity for the first time, not intellectually encountering the concept, bodily encountering the reality. The lamp that came on when you touched it and stayed on as long as you wanted it to, and asked nothing of you in return. Reiko went to the kitchen and found the refrigerator against the far wall. She opened the door. Cold air came out. The interior light activated automatically. On the shelves inside basic supplies: milk, eggs, butter, vegetables. Reiko stood with the door open and the cold air falling around her feet and began to cry. Not loudly, not with drama. Her shoulders moved and her hands gripped the edges of the refrigerator door, and she stood there silently, coming apart in front of an appliance that would not have merited a second glance in any American kitchen. The refrigerator hummed on, indifferent and steady, doing its job. Yuki. The 21-year-old found the bathroom and spent several minutes with the flush toilet flushing it and watching clean water fill the bowl each time with the focused attention of someone who needed to understand the mechanics of something before they could accept it was real. Hana, the eldest of the four, at 34, sat down on the sofa in the living room and covered her face with both hands. Robert stood in the doorway and let it happen. He did not look away. His father had told him to see clearly, and seeing clearly sometimes meant watching things that were uncomfortable to witness. When the immediate wave of reaction had passed, he spoke. "Everything works," he said. "The electricity, the water, the stove. Meals at the community dining hall at 7 noon and 6. You can cook here as well. Ration credits for the camp store will be issued each week." Keiko had come back to the living room. She was standing at the window, looking out at the street where the camp lights were beginning to come on against the early evening sky. Electric lights on automatic timers burning through the night, illuminating nothing more important than gravel paths between cottages. She did not turn when he spoke. Then, after a moment, she did. Their eyes met across the small, clean room. He thought she was going to say something. She did not. She just looked at him with the expression he had come to recognize over 3 days, the one that appeared when the evidence had arrived and the conclusions were forming, and drawing them was going to cost something that could not be recovered. He nodded once. Then he left. Walking back through the camp toward the INS staff quarters, Robert passed the community garden and the baseball diamond, and the swimming pool that the prisoners had built themselves with their own hands. He passed families sitting on their cottage porches in the evening air. German families in one section, Japanese in another, all of them existing in the particular twilight state of people imprisoned in a place that did not look like a prison, navigating the strange specific dignity of Crystal City. He reached his quarters, sat on the edge of his bunk, and took the letter to Thomas out of his breast pocket. He read what he had written on the train. Then he found a pen and added 3 sentences at the bottom. "We arrived today," he wrote. "I watched them see the cottage. I watched a woman cry in front of a refrigerator for 3 minutes because in Japan they deliver ice in blocks twice a week in summer and call that enough. I do not have a way to explain what it looks like when someone finds out that everything they were told about the enemy was wrong. But I know this much. Dad was right about mercy. I am beginning to understand that the hardest part is not having it when you are certain you are right. The hardest part is having it when you are not sure what right looks like anymore." He sealed the envelope and set it on the desk to be mailed in the morning. In cottage number 23, Keiko Tanaka sat in the living room in the dark. Not because she could not turn on the light. She knew how to turn on the light. She sat in the dark because she was not ready yet for that casual luxury, not tonight, not after the day that had happened. Through the window, the camp's streetlights burned their steady burn, illuminating the paths between cottages for no urgent reason, wasting electricity by every Japanese wartime standard, without a second thought. She opened her notebook to the page where she had written 4 words in Nevada. "America is not weak." She read them. Then she turned to a new page and wrote in English again slowly, each word placed with the precision of someone who understood that writing a thing made it permanent in a different way than thinking it. She wrote, "I cannot go back. Not back to Japan." She would go back to Japan. She understood that clearly enough. Back to before. Back to the version of things she had carried onto the transport ship, onto the gangplank, onto the train, into this cottage with its lamp and its refrigerator and its flush toilet that filled with clean water every single time. She could not go back to not knowing. Outside, the lights of Crystal City burned on through the Texas night, indifferent and steady and completely unconcerned with what they were costing anyone. They simply existed because there was enough. Because in this country, in this year, there had always been enough. And the gap between that and what Keiko had come from was so wide and so real and so undeniable that it sat in her chest like a second heartbeat, permanent and insistent, changing the rhythm of everything. She closed the notebook. She sat in the dark and let the truth settle into her at whatever pace it needed. Somewhere across the camp in the INS staff quarters, Robert Hayes lay on his bunk in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about a woman turning a lamp on and off and on again. and thought about his father on the porch in the last fall of his life, and thought about Johnny Reyes in cold water in the dark, and thought about how none of those things were simple enough to hold in a single thought, how they kept pressing against each other, how the certainties he had arrived with were still there, but had shifted in their arrangement like furniture moved in a room he thought he knew. He was not sure what he believed anymore about the enemy. He was sure about one thing only. Tomorrow morning, he was going to escort Keiko Tanaka to the camp hospital, where a flu outbreak among the newly arrived Japanese women needed a nurse who spoke the language. He had put his name on the security escort assignment without being asked. His supervisor had raised an eyebrow. Robert had said he already had a working relationship with the prisoner, which was true, and left it at that. He did not examine his reasons too carefully. He was a man who had grown up working with his hands, and he understood that some things only became clear when you kept moving toward them. The mesquite tree outside cottage number 23 moved in the warm Texas night wind. The camp lights held steady. The refrigerator in the cottage kitchen hummed on through the dark, keeping the milk cold for morning, doing its small, reliable American work without asking for anything in return. Tomorrow was coming, and with it, a conversation about a bottle of sulfanilamide tablets that would crack Robert Hayes's world open the rest of the way. But that was tomorrow. Tonight in Crystal City, Texas, in September of 1944, two people from opposite sides of the most destructive war in human history lay awake in the dark 30 yards apart and thought about what it meant to see something clearly when you had every reason to look away. The bacon was still waiting, but it would not have to wait much longer.